Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision, philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a distinguished author, a part-time author who's managed to write over 1,000 articles from publications ranging from the Washington Post, the New York Times, Newsweek, and several Indian newspapers. What he really does full-time is work at the United Nations as the Under-Secretary General of the Department of Public Communications and Public Relations. Correct me.
Public information.
Public information. I'm delighted to welcome my old friend, Shashi Tharoor.
Good to be with you, Rajiv. It's been too long.
Shashi, you've been a part-time writer and working with the United Nations. And in your role as a writer, you write a great deal about India, and there is this great sense of an Indian identity. How does that reconcile with being UN diplomat? And at the time we record this, you've been here being grilled about the Local Committee report and how that affects India. What do you see yourself as, really?
But actually, I don't see any contradiction, Rajiv. I mean, I see myself as a human being with a number of responses to the world I see around me, some of which I manifest in my work and some of which I manifest in my writing. Of course, being a UN official obliges me in any case to draw a distinction between my official responsibilities and my personal opinions. So it helps that in my work, I do pretty much everything but India, and in my writing, I almost do nothing but India. So that I write in my books about the things that matter to me as a person who is from this country, who has been shaped by this country, and who cares passionately about this country. And in my work, I go off and do everything else. But as I said, I see no contradiction, because in some ways the UN adventure is rather like the Indian adventure. It's a bunch of people who look different, have different colors of skin, wear different kinds of clothes, speak with different accents, eat different kinds of foods, but who dream the same dreams together, share the same space, and work to the same objectives.
No contradiction, but what about private passions and private convictions? And I guess it's a predicament that anybody in a government official service, a diplomat anywhere, whether you're a diplomat for your own country or working for a government you don't sort of entirely approve of or empathize with. For a person with the sensitivity and passion of an author, both sort of a novelist and non-fiction, is that ever a personal predicament, a personal problem that you're able to gloss over effectively, efficiently, of course?
Well, my fundamental convictions are pluralist ones. I mean, both in my work at the UN and in my writing, I've tried to uphold a vision of the world as a world that we must make safe for diversity. So for me, again, that applies whether I write about India and Indian affairs, whether I write a novel set in India, or whether I'm working at the UN. But having said that, I have to admit there are some things one has to, as you put it, gloss over. I'm probably the only author in the world whose copyright page carries a disclaimer saying that though the author is an official of the United Nations, none of the opinions expressed by the characters in this book should be construed as those of the organization or of the author in his official capacity. It seems laughable that it is necessary, because indeed, as a UN official, one is, how can one put it, politically celibate, as it were, whereas as a personal individual, one really has to engage.
In a sense, you've talked about how you have earned yourself the right to write. And you just mentioned and explained that this disclaimer comes at the bottom of the page. How did you manage that? Isn't it sort of rather unusual for someone who's heading the Department for Public Communications, you're the mouthpiece of the United Nations, and you have gotten yourself the freedom to at least implicitly say things that are perhaps against the official view?
Rarely against the official view, but unconnected to the official view. I mean, the thing is that I, frankly, have been doing this since I joined the UN. I haven't always been in public information. I worked with refugees in the initial portion of my career, then in peacekeeping, then in the Secretary General's office, and now finally I've been given this responsibility of managing a public information department. But for many, many years, what I was writing was really pretty much the only thing I was doing publicly. I agree with you now that my job requires me to be very public for the United Nations. And of course, my writing is also a public, how can I put it, a public voice, which I try and make it clear through what I'm saying that I'm speaking only for myself when I write those things, and that when I write or speak for the United Nations, I do so in an institutional capacity. Sometimes, even visually, which is why I'm upset I'm having this personal conversation with you in my UN suit.
Well, tell me about your work at the United Nations. You're pretty near the top of the UN. We keep sort of hearing these reports that, Shashi Tharoor, candidate one day for the Secretary General of the UN. How possible, likely do you think that is? And what is your own sort of feeling and attitude to that?
Well, Rajiv, the feeling obviously is that when you've devoted your life to an organization, as I have, I've spent 27 years at the UN from a very young age. I joined at 22, so it's been an organization that I have really devoted pretty much my entire adult life to, and I genuinely and passionately believe in what it stands for. Both the element of international cooperation, which is so indispensable in a world full of problems without passports, as Kofi Annan once put it, but also the fact that the ideals the organization stands for are ideals that are completely congruent with what I believe, what our country stood for at the moment of its independence, and what all of us, I think, in our saner moments, would like to see the world abide by. So, to me, with that kind of conviction, obviously any opportunity to serve this organization, including at the most effective levels, would be absolutely fabulous. But I'm not an illusionist. I have no sort of unrealistic expectations about these matters. I think that right now we have a Secretary General who's got a year to go for his term, and he finishes only on the 31st of December 2006. I'm working for him. I've got a job to do, and I'm focused very much on it. In the meantime, there are a number of candidates who've declared their candidacy. I'm not amongst them.
The United Nations is often perceived as being very influenced by the United States, despite sort of your very emphatic idealism and conviction and beliefs about the United Nations, which in a sense one would expect you to have, dare I say, given your job and profile. There is skepticism about how certain powers dominate the United Nations, the United Nations' role in Iraq, reform of the United Nations, the possibility of India's seat in the Security Council. I really want to move on to sort of the other you that I think that many of us in India sort of celebrate in some senses more than the UN. Give us a lowdown on what you think of the United Nations, and what you see, and what would you say to people in India from someone who has this intimate contact and experience of its inner workings. What is the real UN?
I would say that, first of all, you really have to be both an idealist and a realist to work at the UN. You have to be an idealist, because otherwise you may as well go somewhere else and make money in a multinational corporation or whatever. The purpose of the organization is the only worthwhile reason to serve it. But it's an organization where you pursue those ideals very much within the limitations of what is politically possible. And that's where the realism comes in. We can't afford the luxury that a non-governmental organization or a church group or a crusading journalist or whatever can afford to have in articulating ideals and saying this is where the world should be. Because in the UN, we are a combination of 191 governments, and we know that what we can accomplish depends very much on what those governments are prepared to see us accomplish. Our mandates come from governments, the resources to fulfill those mandates come from governments, and the political support to make them happen come from government.
You're watching a conversation with the author and UN diplomat Shashi Tharoor. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Shashi Tharoor. I described you in my introduction saying that you were a part-time writer. In some senses, perhaps, writing is more your, what shall I say, a vocation, and the United Nations is your profession. I don't know if that's an adequate description, but that's the sense that I have of your work. You were a child protege, Shashi, that you'd, at age 10, you had started writing, and I remember at, the Junior Statesman, Operation Bellows, a short story of yours was serialized.
That's a memory you've got.
And you've been writing a very long time. What is the passion that drives you to write? I mean, you've said you were an asthmatic child, and so writing was your hobby, just as doing other things were for other people. Writing has a sort of great romanticism about it. Personal catharsis, creating order in the external universe, an escape from mundane reality. What is writing for you?
Well, I'm going to be very unromantic and use George Bernard Shaw's wonderful line that I write for the same reason a cow gives milk. I mean, it's inside me, it has to come out, and in a very real way I'd suffer if it didn't. But it's true that I began writing at a time when, as a child, fortunately perhaps, there were fewer distractions available to me than there are to children today. I mean, I was an asthmatic child, often bedridden. There was no television in the Bombay of my boyhood. There was no Nintendo or computer games or whatever. So basically one had books, reading them or writing them. And then, you know, books, I was the eldest child in the family, so I didn't have books of elder brothers and sisters I could read. My parents' books, whichever ones I could understand, I devoured, but all too rapidly. And when I was taken off to a library to borrow a book, I read inconveniently fast and often finished it in the car on the way home. So I was often thrown to my own devices, and there's only so much book cricket you can play. So in a sense I started writing, and writing very derivatively, like, you know, Indian versions, as it were, of Enid Blyton stories or the Biggle stories or whatever, because that was frankly a way of self-expression that also kept my mind engaged at a time when I was frankly struggling to breathe as an asthmatic. It was a character-forming experience, but it also became something that I did for myself. Then, to my surprise, my father took this seriously, typed up the stories and so on. And when the first of them was published, when I was 10 years old, then of course it became an addiction. I mean, nothing more addictive in the world than seeing your name in print, I fear. It's sort of worse than the first chocolate or the first kiss. I mean, it really keeps you wanting to have more. And so I kept writing, and I did write throughout my school and college days. But you know, middle-class parents who said, you can write all you like, but you better do well at your studies because no writer makes a decent living in this country, which may have been true in the 60s, I know no longer is, but that became ingrained in me, and so I felt always an obligation to pursue quote-unquote conventional success, doing well at exams and doing well at college and going off.
Well, you did sort of embarrassingly well at exams, and then consistently you were a PhD from Fletcher at 22, and I seem to remember that you sort of get 5 points in senior Cambridge, which was again sort of, you know, an intimidating sort of reality for other people around you. Academic brilliance. What kind of mind did that sort of yield and breed for you, that manages to cope with the mundaneness, perhaps, of bureaucratic processes, of diplomacy? Do you ever feel constricted as this writer seeking expression by your job?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fair. Of course, there is a certain level of constraint, and certainly, you know, sometimes in my work I do have to spend a lot of time, you know, saying a lot without meaning very much, and that's part of, unfortunately, the business of not causing offense to member states of the United Nations. And, you know, in a sense, one understands the value of that. It's not merely bureaucratic cowardice. It is because in the real world you have to work with all governments, and you don't insult a government today that you have to try and persuade tomorrow.
Do you miss intellectual abandon?
Well, I try and give myself as much of that as possible, both through reading and through personal contacts with intellectuals or thinkers. I'm a fellow of something called the New York Institute of the Humanities. I try and go to talks when I can. I enjoy, whenever I have time permits, engaging with audiences, student audiences, intellectual audiences, either on the subject of India or on the subject of the United Nations. So I've not denied myself the cut and thrust of intellectual debate and intellectual stimulation.
Go back to this aspect of your writing. What prompts you to write on a particular theme or an issue? What becomes the impetus, the catalyst? You are prolific. You know, sort of 3 novels and you know, more than half a dozen books. And as I mentioned, you know, 1,000+ articles. You're doing columns. You know, you're just writing all the time.
Not sleeping enough.
Is there sort of a gestation period? Do you have time to think about what you write?
Very fair question, because of course the articles, I must say, an idea will occur to me, and the rest of it works itself out on the screen as I'm writing on the computer. And I tend, in any case, to be dominated by the tyranny of the deadline. My column in the Hindu is every other Sunday, and that's it. You know, one has to churn it out, whether it's midnight the previous Sunday that you're writing it, or whether you have more leisurely time. And so some of those pieces are indeed one idea vehicles, though I'm pleased to say that some others have have sufficiently thought through that they have lasted and been circulated beyond that. But having said that, the question of writing a book has been more of a problem for me. I mean, it's been a while since my last novel, and the reason is that to write fiction, and write particularly something as substantial as a novel, one needs both time, which is difficult enough for me, and a space inside one's head, which is now becoming almost impossible.
Shashi, you're rated a very good writer.
Thank you.
Do you miss being a truly great writer because you have other obligations and commitments to be, and one day, take the time off and sort of, become a Naipaul or a Rushdie or whoever
Well, it's a
else?
question I've asked myself, Rajiv, to be honest. In fact, the Washington Post put it in black and white in one of their reviews. They said, imagine what this fellow could do if he gave up his day job, which was, I suppose, a backhanded compliment, but at the same time, it is sobering to think that in some ways, perhaps I have not done fully justice to myself as a writer because I've taken on this other life. But I'm cursed, if you like, with the sense that both these aspects of my life are important to me. And if I gave up either one or the other, a part of my psyche would wither on the vine. It's not that the UN is just a job. I've been very lucky with the work I've done. I've worked in things that have been passionate, that have engaged me, that have made a difference to human beings' lives, and that at the same time have never been routine bureaucratic paper shuffling, of which there are also jobs in bureaucracies. I mean, one accepts that if you're an accountant or an administrator, you're not going to feel the kind of passion that you feel running a refugee camp or dealing with a peacekeeping operation in the middle of a hot war, or being before the world's television cameras putting forward the message of an organization that's under fire. So in all of these things, I have been very fortunate. But from that good fortune has come a strong sense of commitment to the cause, not just the job.
You're watching a conversation with the UN diplomat and author, Shashi Tharoor. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Shashi Tharoor. Beyond the sort of the skin of the UN diplomat and the writer, do you ever experience a longing, a wanting to reach out for something beyond other than where you are and what you're doing?
Of course, Rajiv. I mean, I think we all feel those longings.
What is that sort of aspiration that you have for yourself?
Well, I would say it is fundamentally to leave this planet in some way changed for the better for one's having been on it. I mean, that sounds grossly presumptuous, and I'm conscious of that. But I think we've all been parked here for a purpose, and each of us will find that purpose, in my view, through doing rather than only through aspiring. And so I have done what fate or circumstances have given me the opportunity to do. But I've never been excessively wedded to titles and institutions, knowing full well that these are transient. I mean, I am today an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Not very long into the future, I may not be anything of the sort. And at that point, I will have to make choices about where I want to be and what I want to do with my time in a way that will make me feel that I made a contribution to the society in which I find myself and the people amongst whom I was born.
You've mentioned fate and circumstances, and certainly sort of in your professional life, there has been sort of an internal logic to the unfolding of your life.
Only in hindsight. Only in hindsight. Believe me, at no stage in my working life have I known where I would be 2 years down the road and what I'd be doing. It's entirely worked out the way it has without much foresight or planning. It's the way I write, I might add. I don't plan my books from beginning to end.
But has there been that element then of surrender and waiting for life to unfold?
Except that I'm not waiting. I mean, I certainly do have a very strong sense of faith in something much greater than myself or than anything that rational human explanation can provide. At the same time, I'm not arrogant enough to presume that there is some divine force that has chosen me to do something more than somebody else. I think one has to work very hard for everything one does, and I'm working very hard. And I certainly am conscious that there are lots of other people who work very hard and perhaps have not had the same opportunities. So there is a certain element of luck, for lack of a better word, in what one is able to accomplish. But I've never stopped striving. I've never allowed myself to be complacent. I've never told myself that things have come easily or have come because I deserve them. They have come, and I've done justice to them to the best of my ability. And that's always going to be the spirit in which I'll work and live the rest of my life.
You've mentioned sort of divine. That's sort of what form and shape does this sort of your believing in the divine take? Is there a practice that's associated with it?
I'm very comfortable in, for I suppose a shorthand phrase would be sort of Upanishadic Hinduism. I'm a believing Hindu because I'm very moved not only by what I've read of Hinduism, all in English rather than in Sanskrit, but in read as widely as I could. And I'm also, quite frankly, conscious that ultimately all religions in Hindu belief are all equal ways to the same ultimate truth. And therefore one may as well be comfortable with the religion into which one was born, and I was born a Hindu. I've never been terribly fond of organized religion. I'm not a great temple goer, but I do pray regularly at home, and I pray very consciously to an image that I know is a human image, or indeed a set of images, because as the Upanishads have often taught us, as Vedanta teaches us, the divine is essentially unknowable. What human beings need is a crutch, a tool, to imagine in humanly comprehensible terms something which no human being can truly have knowledge of, direct experience of, and therefore cannot imagine in a real
Would it be too personal a question to ask you what some of these images are?
Well, actually, no, I don't. I mean, for me, as I said, because I'm conscious, these are just images. I have essentially tried to focus my mind in prayer on kitschy calendar art paintings of the gods that happened to have been in my family's prayer room when I was a child. And I have absolutely no belief that if one day we go off to the astral plane, we will meet gods who look like that. I think these are human imaginings of what divine reality there may or may not be. But as I said, it is a way of focusing one's mind ultimately on something greater than oneself and greater than that for which science has answers.
Each time you're sort of able to, you visit India, you have access and you meet with, well, I don't know exactly who, but certainly prime ministers and presidents and people who matter and count. Do you have an aspiration? Do you have a vision of coming back and doing something in India? And does it have any sort of concrete form and shape?
It has no concrete form as such, in the sense that, yes, I've always felt that India matters to me, and through my writing I've tried to matter to India, or at least to some Indians, or at least to some Indian readers, if I want to be completely modest about it. Yes, I think after the UN, whatever I do next will have to involve India. But in what form I can be of service remains to be seen. I mean, our country is not lacking in either people or talent. And I would certainly not want to presume that after all the years I've spent away from home, that I have any particular answers that haven't already been thought of by people in this country. But I would like to serve. I think I have some sense of the skills that I can bring to bear. And if there are opportunities where I can make a difference, whether through my pen, if that's the old-fashioned metaphor, through the keyboard, I suppose one should say, or through my voice, or through my experience and my analytical skills, I would want to put them at the service of India, certainly.
Most people, most Indians, travel abroad at age 22 and age 20, and
19
start,
when
19,
I went off
my
after
goodness,
college, yeah.
and start studying abroad and spend that much time overseas. You have retained a very strong sense of your Indianness, your Indian identity, expressed through its writings. But you have an Indian passport. What is it about India that has retained its sort of influence, hold, inspiration for you? Are you able to sort of articulate that, quantify it beyond the intuitive feeling of connection?
Totally. I mean, the intuitive feeling of connection is important because the country you grew up in is ultimately the place you feel on your pulse, and I feel it strongly. But it's also, quite frankly, that India is intellectually the most exciting place on earth today. It is the place where some of the most important debates facing the world at the start of the 20th century are being played out. I mean, fundamental debates about the nature of society, the nature of the polity, bread versus freedom, the famous old debate going back to our days as students in the emergency. All of these things are fundamental issues: secularism versus fundamentalism, centralization versus federalism, guns versus butter. I mean, all of these issues are here in India. And the British historian E.P. Thompson put it better than I can when he said that India is perhaps the most important country for the future of the world because all the currents on this planet run through this society. And he added, there is not a thought that is being thought in the East or the West that is not active in some Indian mind. And to me, I'm glad a Brit said that, not an Indian, but it's also reflective of the fact that we are in many ways an extraordinary microcosm of the fundamental questions facing the world. We have real challenges. We're not a society that feels we have reached the end of history. I mean, we had a long and distinguished history, but we have a very important future. And being part of that is a lot.
Is there sort of this? I'm looking for the sort of the Shashi, beneath the skin, in a sense. That is sort of it is the largest sweep of India and its people and what have you. What are the elements of Shashi Tharoor, the human being, that feels bonded and connected to India?
Well, you know, my parents used to take me back every year to our ancestral village in Kerala, where we have a crumbling 200-year-old house where, bless her soul, my grandmother still lives. And that is to me in many ways, and I recognize no Indian village is typical of the whole of the country because of our enormous variations, but that to me typifies the sort of roots, if you like, that I have come from. I've only lived in Kerala on these holidays. I've never studied there. I'm one of Kerala's few surviving illiterates because I can speak a colloquial Malayalam, but I can't read or write it. And so I don't want to exaggerate the extent, if you like, or the profundity of my connection. But at the same time, to go to village India, to see how it has transformed itself under Indian democracy in the course of my own childhood and indeed my own lifetime, has been a fabulous eye-opening experience. I've written about this in India from Midnight to the Millennium. It's, to me, a concern that I would like to see replicated elsewhere. I'd like to see the fact that we have in Kerala, for example, a state where if you take all the social indicators and you line up Kerala's indicators with America's, you know, literacy rates, empowerment of women, number of doctors per patients and number of, you know, patients per hospital beds, newspapers and mass media and so on and so forth, you find practically identical indicators. In some cases, Kerala is better than the US. The only thing that's different is that the US has 25 times the per capita income. Now, if Kerala can do that, I believe so can the rest of India. And the question is, watching that change has taught me much about the potential that our country has to make a better world for all the people in it.
Shashi Tharoor, the writer, diplomat, and I'm just going back in a sense from another view to the same question. What is it that most passionately moves you, stirs you, drives you internally, inside of yourself? You know, beyond all the sort of the positions, the articulations that we all have to sort of take and make in life. Is Shashi Tharoor the human being? What is it that you feel most moved about when you see or hear or feel most passionately that impacts you in the deep recesses of your being?
Injustice of any sort. I mean, you know, discriminations of various kinds, whether it's against individuals, against women, against nations of certain sorts. I mean, I think that ultimately this planet is large enough for all of us in it, and that it's the intolerance, the injustice of discrimination that in many, many ways reduces us to less than we are as human beings.
A particular brand of it, a particular form of it?
All of it, frankly. I have very little patience for religious intolerance, for example. I think that, again, perhaps this is an excessively Hindu idea, but the fact is that, you know, there is ultimately one force that has created us all, and the fact that we have different ways of stretching our hands out to that force, to that divine presence, doesn't justify hitting somebody else on the head because he or she chooses a different view. Religious intolerance is awful. Gender discrimination is criminal. Societies in which half the population, in effect, are languishing because their talents are not being used merely because they happen to be born in the wrong gender. Social discrimination, caste discrimination. I mean, again, in Kerala, I've seen enormous transformations in that. I have to say, in other parts of our country, the transformations have been much slower coming. And to think that people are condemned to a certain kind of existence merely because of the accident of birth is unforgivable. And that applies, by the way, to discrimination on the grounds of race in other countries, or the grounds of ethnicity in other countries, and caste in our country. I think this has to be overcome. It's one of those things for which there is no excuse. This has to be fought. And ultimately, those are the things that move me most. It's injustice and intolerance, simply because I think the opposite is so easy. It is actually much easier for human beings to be tolerant. It is much easier for human beings to be fair. It makes for a more pleasant life, even for those who are wasting their energies in discrimination and hatred.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much. This has been a great pleasure meeting up with you on television again.
Great to see an old friend. Thank you.